What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and in today's episode of the fighting game tutorial series, we are going to be going over improving our settings menu. Mainly what we're going to be doing is allowing us to actually visualize these sliders as we're selecting them. Because before we just had to assume we were over one when navigating, but now we have these colors that we can use to determine when we are actually on one. Now when we leave one, you'll notice that the colors don't go away for the sound effects volume slider, so it still shows as that gold color which is selected, but we're going to be fixing that up during this episode. I want to do that part live because I think it makes a little bit more sense that way, but you should see that everything is now easily navigated and you can tell where you're at on the menu at all times. This is incredibly important for real players to play our game, but also important for us to make sure that things are working as intended. We'll also do some cleanup in the settings menu to make things a little bit better. So if you're interested in getting caught up in the series, before you check out this episode, you can see how we've done everything from our character select screen, our stages, our loading, and a lot more. Alternatively, if you only care about the settings menu and the slider bars, then I recommend you watch this episode right here, which is the first episode of our settings menu, as all of these episodes are building on top of each other, so it would be good to have the knowledge of how the settings menu works from the ground up. That way you can go ahead and update it to work like you see in this video here. But with that out of the way, we can go ahead and get started. This is a code and blueprint tutorial series, but we only need the blueprints today because we're going to be specifically working in the settings screen widget. So we can start out by going to blueprints, widgets, menus, settings screen. I want to update two things right away, but it will make our logic easier to read and understand. So first things first, if we go into our determine chosen options function right here. In this function, we were determining what row we were on when moving selections. So if we're moving up and down, we need to change between the versus time row, the versus rounds row, so on and so forth. Our music volume and sound effect volume sliders are up at the top right now. They're at index 0 and index 1, and before in the series we didn't have anything here. We just had these two reroute nodes and we weren't doing anything. Technically that's fine because that will just return null. So instead of returning a button, it just returns nothing. However, I've chosen to manually insert the return nodes because it makes it easier to read and understand what's going on. So instead of having the blueprint say, yeah, I'm just not returning anything, we're going to say return node and pass nothing into it. So add return node and just leave it completely blank. This determine chosen options is really just for the buttons. It was made to set the correct states for the buttons on the settings menu so we know what options we've selected. We do have a separate function for this for sliders, and since these first two rows are sliders, we don't want to handle them here. So we just want to call it return node and pass nothing into it. Now after that, I want to go to my determine slider to focus function right here. And I'm going to do a very similar thing. So this is determining what slider we're currently on. And this was working by using the row that we're currently on. So we know that row 0 is the music volume slider, row 1 is the sound effects volume slider. If we're not on either of those rows, this switch statement will hit the default value. In this case, could be any of our buttons. If we're past these rows, we're likely on a button on our settings menu. In this case, we don't want to handle it in determine slider to focus. So you can see here, now on the default, I am adding return node and then not passing anything into the current slider. Now, actually, one more thing with determine chosen options. If you want, you can do the same with default here as well. Leaving it blank, again, is technically just returning nothing, but you could also manually plug it in to the top one here or something similar, so you just know we're returning nothing. And if you want, you could even clean it up further by just plugging them all into this one return node. And so if it's a slider or an unknown value, just don't return a button. Alright, so that's the cleanup that we've done. Now we want to get into the actual behavior we're adding for the episode. What we're doing for today's episode is making sure that when we are selecting a slider, we actually display a change to the user. That way they know that they are hovering over that slider and they can actually use it. So what we need to do is determine when we need to display changes to the user, or basically when the slider is selected. We're going to handle that in move selection. So if we open up move selection, this one has quite a bit of logic because we have horizontal and vertical movement in our game. If it is horizontal movement, we go to this top section here, and if we are not within the bounds, then we check to see if there's a button that's focusable, and if there's not, then we determine what slider we're on. That way we can actually move it appropriately, but this is for horizontal movement. So this is moving the value within the slider. This isn't actually selecting the slider, or like navigating to the slider. That would be vertical movement, because we're moving up and down between our options to our music volume slider, our sound effect volume slider, or some of the buttons below them. So if we follow the false for is horizontal movement, come down here, this will check the bounds for our vertical movement. If we are able to move, we update where we're at by determining the new button that we're focusing. Now, determine button to focus works by returning null or no button if we're in either of the slider rows. Now, this is very similar to what we were just editing, right? But the difference with this one is the button that we're focusing is the one that we're currently hovering or highlighting. The chosen options are the ones that we've already selected and we're displaying to the user. So although very similar, they are different, and you can see this one we did it correctly by passing in the return node with no button. So if no button is returned, then this won't be valid. So before, what we were doing is calling determine button to focus, display hovered options, and then playing a sound effect with it. However, I don't want to display the hovered options if we're not actually on a button, because display hovered options is the button style changing function. So we take the button, and if it's one of the buttons that's not already confirmed, then we set this style. Otherwise, we set this style. Again, requiring a button object reference. If there is no button that would be passed into here, if it's null, this wouldn't do anything. So if there's no button, we need to determine what slider we're able to focus, or which slider we're currently over top of, which one we're selecting. We can do this by just adding an isValid check to this current button return parameter. So drag off current button, isValid. We want the one with a question mark for ease of use. If it is valid, we go and do the same thing that we've been doing already in the series. If it's not valid, however, we go and add this new logic. So all this is new for today's episode. We want to call determine slider to focus, first of all. This function is the one we were editing earlier that just determines, based on our row, are we on the music volume slider, the sound effect volume slider, or none of them. And it returns that slider as this current slider parameter. Now I want to drag off of this current slider and check if this is valid. If this is valid, only if it's valid, we can then display the active slider to the user. So this is a function that we need to make. So plus function, I've called it display active slider. It doesn't have any output parameters, but it does have an input parameter called slider ref. And it's just going to take in the current slider from the previous function here, the determine slider to focus. To add a new variable for determine slider to focus, we want to go to our output parameters, add a new parameter, and then for the type, we want it to be a type of slider, and we want it to be an object reference. So drag display active slider into the graph, pass in current slider into the slider ref. Then you'll get what we have here. Now, one additional note, you can actually add sound effects here, because this sound effect that we're playing is anytime we change buttons or do vertical movement. We probably want to do that sound effect for sliders as well. So you can go ahead and combine your logic here, the button and the slider logic if you want. That way a sound effect plays when changing to your slider. Now let's go into display active slider and fill that function out. So here's display active slider. We have our slider reference. What we need to do is check against all the other sliders that exist and see which one we are currently hovering over or selecting. That way we can actually change its color and display that to the user. So like a lot of my other functions in this widget, I am going to make an array out of all my possible options of this type, which are my music volume slider. I want to get that, and my sound effects volume slider. I want to get that. Then I want to drag off of them and type make array, add a pin, and plug the other one in. If you have more sliders, add them all to this array. Then I want to drag off the array that gets created and loop through every single element using a for each loop. I want to check to see if the current element that we're on is equal to the slider reference. So we can drag off of this equal, type branch, and then you'll get everything that you see right here. Now what we need to do is take the array element and set the slider bar color based on if it was equal or if it wasn't equal. If it was equal, it's true. If it wasn't equal, it's false. So array element, set slider bar color. And note, you can change what you're doing here. You don't have to set the slider bar color. You could set the bar thickness. You could set the bar image. You could do a ton of stuff with this. Setting the bar color just makes it very easy. So if it's true, I chose a gold color to show that we're selecting it, but you can pick whatever color you want, obviously. So just go in here, pick your color, hit OK, and there you go. Now if it's false, we want to reset it back to the default value. The default value for me is simply white. I haven't changed the slider bar color, and so it still appears as white. So I want to set my slider bar color as white. If you want my colors exactly, I'll give them to you. So here is my selected color. You can pause that and copy those if you want. And my not selected color, my default color, is simply white. And now we have display active slider working as intended. We should be good to go here. We can go back to the event graph. In the event graph, we also want to update the behavior so that the correct selection displays right away. Before, we didn't really care about this because we were selecting the slider right away when we came into the menu, but we didn't have any way to display that to the user, so it didn't matter. But now that we do have a way to display it to the user, it does matter. So I'm going over to essentially the end of my event construct, where we were setting current widget and displaying the chosen slider values. I went ahead and called move selection in between these nodes. So basically, once everything is already set up in this widget, I'm going to call move selection, which is going to trigger all that behavior that we showed earlier in the episode. However, I'm not passing in a direction. I'm saying there's no horizontal movement, so it technically counts it as a vertical move. And I'm choosing not to play sound effects because it wasn't a move by the user. Now, additionally, you could just call your display active slider or something similar. But I like doing the move selection in case there's other things I want to do at the start with other widgets or elements on this widget. And once you do this, it will automatically display properly when you go into your settings screen. Now, the other thing we have to do is reset the behavior style when we stop highlighting one of the sliders, right? So if we go from the slider to the button, the slider should no longer be highlighted, but the button should be. And same with when we go from the button to the slider. The button should no longer be highlighted, but the slider should be. To fix what I was just mentioning, we can go back to move selection where we had initially implemented the slider logic. In this top section here, we were checking to see if there was a button that we could focus. If it was valid, we were displaying that hovered option or that selected option. If it is valid that a button can be focused, that means none of the sliders can be focused. So what we want to do at this point is call display active slider, but we don't want to pass anything into it. So I'm going to leave the slider reference null or invalid, because if we do that, then when we come in here, it won't be equal to any of the sliders that we have in our array, which will make this branch return false, and will always return the default value, which is white or unselected. So in this case, it's like we're not hovering over or using the slider anymore, which we shouldn't be because we're on a button now. The other case is down below the logic that we added in this episode, where our sliders are. If we're on a slider, then we can't possibly be on a button. So if the slider is valid, we want to call the function to reset the buttons. Now we have a few functions that technically can do this. We have display hovered options or display confirmed options, but those ones are a little bit different because of what they require. They would work with slight modifications, but we do have one that will work with no modifications. That is our clear pass selections function, because this is just here to clear anything that we're not currently hovering over. And in this case, if we don't pass anything into the button reference, then it's assumed we're not hovering over the buttons. The clear pass selection uses all the buttons in an array. So if none of the buttons are equal to the invalid or null button that we passed into the function, and they won't be, then they won't be highlighted or shown to the user as being selected unless they're part of the confirmed options array. And if they're part of the confirmed options array, those are the settings that are actually selected, not where the player is currently hovering in the menu. So you'll see the outline style instead of the actual active style for those buttons. So adding these two nodes into move selection like we did will make sure that whether we're on buttons or sliders, only the appropriate widget element will be selected at a time. And you can see this in action right here in this demo. As I go past the sliders, I get to the buttons, and these sliders are no longer highlighted, and then when I go back to the sliders, the buttons are no longer highlighted. So anyway guys, I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Fighting Game tutorial series. I hope it helped you improve your settings menu and your sliders in general. If it did, please consider subscribing and supporting the channel further through Patreon, YouTube memberships, or Discord subscriptions. You guys are amazing, and it really supports the channel a lot, so thank you so much for those that already have. If you ran into any problems while following this tutorial, or any of my tutorials, feel free to join the Discord community. There's a link in the description, and I would be happy to assist you. That support is also completely free. Anyway guys, that's all I got, so thank you so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye guys.